I think there have been some great learnings over the last couple of days. The sessions have just been fantastic, moving from, we talked about theory and we talked about reviewing and we've talked about the method section. And so there have been just a number of really great things that came out of the session. So for our final session, Sriram from Michigan State is going to talk about writing a compelling introduction. And as noted, at least in the breakout room I was in, this was one of the biggest topics because it's the first thing that editors see. And so if you want to kind of, or hopefully try to avoid the desk reject, then this introduction piece is very, very, very important. So Sriram, again, I thank you. I know I probably asked you for way too many favors and I apologize for that, but I appreciate you being here, as does the audience. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Wendy, for the opportunity. Thank you. Nice to meet you all. And I'm Sriram. I'm at Michigan State. I've been around here for 15 years now. So let me, without much ado, I'm going to get straight cut to the chase. Just before I get started, how many of you have, other than the editors who I can see on the call, have a published research paper? Could you just do a show of hands? Or multiple published research papers? I can see some hands. Yeah, great. So if I can ask, could somebody tell me what were the problems? Why is introduction very important in your view? Maybe unmute and speak out loud a little bit. And what do you feel when you write the introduction? Do you write the introduction last? Do you write the introduction first? What is your strategy? Go ahead. Priscilla, did I say that?
Yes, I think that I normally start by writing the introduction, but when I end the paper, I go back and review the introduction to see if it's aligned with the whole paper. But what I found that the most difficult thing when writing the introduction is really to highlighting the gaps, the literature gaps, and why the research is so important.
Why the research is so important, and does your introduction change after you finish the paper? I'm curious. Do you think it was good enough, not good enough?
Normally changes a lot, and during the revision process, it changes like completely.
That's right. That's right. Welcome to the club. Yes, I think that's how it works. I think I'm pretty sure most of us are the same way. The reviewers almost come back and say, I just don't like your introduction. The problem motivation is really not good enough, right? I mean, I think that's sort of the big one. And a lot of my graphics you'll find are from PhD comics. Of course I love them because they're just fantastic, right? So this is really what I kind of go through, to be frank with you, when I start writing, right? So when I have to pick up a paper, I'm like, come on, write it. Come on, write it. And then I'm like, yeah, I just can't write it. There are some days when you just finish 4 sentences and then walk off thinking, you know what, I just didn't do enough. Does that sound familiar to you? Maybe if you're smarter, you can write like a whole 2-3 pages. But I sort of find that if I write 2 cohesive paragraphs in one day, it sounds like a gift, but it's true, right? I mean, I think that's sort of the frustration we kind of feel, right? Now the question is this, right? So then you say, if you are, this is true, of course, PhD comics, you say it's true of a doctoral student, but it's not really true. I think it's true of any time in your career. I still feel this, right? So you say, oh, writing should not be so hard. How would I write? Everything I want to say, I already know, right? But I just have to transfer it from my brain to that darn computer. And what's left in between is the keyboard, right? So, but really, it's challenging. You got to figure out what you want to say, and you have to say it in short sentences because people don't have time to read, what you're thinking. And I think it usually starts from inside, right? I mean, organizing inside, or perhaps using paper and pen style organizing different people have different approaches to how to think about it and how they do this, right? So and what's really important to think about is that it is the first impression. Like Wendy accurately put it, you're reading an introduction, and what I find many times is that this is just true of many people. Most reviewers, productive reviewers, and including editors, everybody is nice, but just they are overwhelmed. Nobody has superhuman sense of attentiveness to every single word and line that anybody writes, right? I mean, it's true. So you have to have some way of simplifying things, saying it in clean language, not having to, say a lot, but say what you want to say, right? And that's really important. And I also think it's almost like, writing a paper. I'm not going to say reviewing a paper is like that, but certainly writing a paper is like a dating process, right? So you basically, you are judging no matter what. You just can't escape it, right? So, but good reviewers, good editors would basically read the same thing 3 times over, right? They're not just saying, oh, I'm going to judge it and throw it away because I didn't understand it right now. There is certainly a question that we need to ask ourselves that, oh, do I understand this? Do they want to say something different? And there's a little bit of thought experimentation that actually needs to go on. It's not pure dating from that vantage point, right? So you say, oh, I like this person, don't like this person, but you're actually giving them a chance to be good, right? So that part, I think, is sort of the reading component of it, right? So you read and you are asking yourself, okay, what can this be saying? Can this be saying something else than what they are saying or what I am thinking they are saying? So those components are also there, right? But the introduction should also have another component, right? It's like enticing the reader. You want to give them a carrot, but you have not given them the carrot yet. They are chasing your carrot because their brain cells should be saying, oh, I want to read the next paragraph and see. And I'm describing an ideal world to you. Don't ask me, do you do this? I will say no. So because I probably will never feel I'm doing this. But the thing is that you have to give them the carrot, right? So what is the connection between the first paragraph? What is the connection between the second paragraph, right? And then those naturally relate to what the goal of your paper is as well. Equally important to think about. Most really good papers have all of these elements, and we'll talk a little bit more as we go along, right? Or the other thing I look at, the other example I think of is a GPS, right? So a GPS is supposed to tell you the direction. A paper's paragraphs and sections are supposed to be like a GPS for a reader, right? So somebody wants to go from start to end. It's basically a cohesive, simple problem that you're trying to describe. And then the GPS tells them, what a reader is likely to see. Because readers don't like uncertainty. At least that's my experience. There is a certain amount of uncertainty in the sense of what comes next. Okay, that's the most uncertainty I want to take. I don't want to take any more uncertainty than that. So if you can slowly figure out what you're breaking to somebody, then you sort of have captured the attention of a reader, and you're going to walk them through the rest of the paper, hopefully, right? That's the idea. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the 30-40 minutes I have is to walk you through something that is existing. What I've done is integrated a whole bunch of material that I find very relevant. And it turns out that these are dissertation models for doctoral students. If some of you are doctoral students, you might find it even more useful. But I think that they are as applicable when you think of them as a paper. How many of you have heard of this CARS model, creating a research space model? So the idea is that, how do you create a research space? If you are trying to look at a problem, right, and you're finding a problem, then it's really important to outline and create your research space. It's like you're sticking out your territory, and then you are constructing on that territory, right? That's sort of a building, for example, on that territory. That's sort of my analogy to this. But then there are three components to this, right? So the first component is what we call as establishing the territory. Okay. The second is posing the problem itself. How do you pose the problem and present the gap to somebody? Then you occupy the niche, right? So there are three components to this, and as we go along, I will show you how this is done. And what I have kind of done later on is there's a very nice AMR editorial. So all of my slides are cited, so you can pick up these sites and go to the respective papers. So it's just the integration is mine, the papers are not mine. So we can always talk and debate, right? So in establishing a territory, what we want to make a central claim, make topic generalizations, not over generalizations, just generalizations, right? And then reviewing previous research. What have people done? Because all of our work builds on somebody else's work. I hardly find papers which, even when you're trying to break new ground, you're sort of coming at things purely on your own. I think that rarely happens. But for most regular work, including what I try to do, I think we always build on others' ideas, right? So that's very important. The establishing of a niche is basically presenting the problem itself. So here's a gap. Somebody says A, somebody says B, but A and B are not necessarily, jiving very well together, and that gap has to be really sharp. And you have to present that structure, right? And this, to me, takes the longest time in conceptualization and internal thinking. For example, we have this, me and my co-author, we have this SMJ paper that we wrote a long time ago, about 8 years ago, that came out. So we took almost a year to figure out what exactly was the niche, how we were going to present the hook and the niche, right? So maybe we were slow, but sometimes it can take up to a year, right? So and then you occupy the solution, you present the purpose, and then you think about what and how of your research, announce your main findings. So to me, the most important aspect of this is the middle one, right? So if you can present the middle one very sharp, very precise, you had a really good you have a really good shot at convincing a reader that you're doing something innovative. But to do the second one, you need a very strong grasp of the first one, right? But then the third one, I find, might follow, but still important to present, right? It's a presentation aspect. So let's go through each one of them, right? I'm going to try and do quickly. Wendy, you're probably going to time me, right? So we have, so I don't overstep mine. So the step one, claiming centrality. The idea is establish topic is useful, relevant, and worth my time. So for example, I'll go back to some of my current work, right? So what I am very interested in learning is how do you integrate individuals with disabilities in factory settings. Now, the question to me is that, okay, so what are the concepts I'm going to be drawing on? Some concepts I'm going to be drawing on are from Galbraith's work on Thurblicks, traditional age-old production management techniques. But then they only talk about techniques, right? They don't talk necessarily about the people. There is a whole range of literature around vocational rehabilitation on how people behave under certain circumstances. Now, work creates those circumstances. So that's sort of really important and relevant for how I want to think about that problem. Then there's a third stream of work I like to think about, which is what I call as operational design. We talk a lot about lean, 5S, and all of these different implementations, but how do those concepts actually tie into individuals' behavior in a given situation? I don't know, right? So now I think about how do I establish centrality of a topic. Sometimes it's easy to establish, sometimes it's quite hard, right? But so the idea here is, okay, it's worth my time. It's worth my time to think about what will happen if I put a person on a factory in a job and how do I assess and think about some of these interactions, right? So some of the keywords that you can use are, okay, studied extensively, received considerable attention. Some topics have received considerable attention, right? A large body of literature. It's a central issue. Knowledge has great importance. For me, that knowledge has great importance. Probably, I would not say it's been studied extensively, but subcomponents have been studied extensively, right? What is less studied is how do I bring them together? Then you can get into making topic generalizations, right? So where we say, okay, the certain features of the problem are very well known, and the issue is widely applicable. It could be a standard operating practice. Those are sort of my generalization terms. So for example, if I take workers with disabilities on factory floors, there are lots of features of the problem that are very well known. Productivity is an often debated issue in these settings, right? And it's a widely applicable, and there are conflicting views. There are no generally accepted views on are these people more productive or less productive. But besides the point, the issue is not productivity. The issue is operational configurations. That's the way we would like to say it, right? And then you sort of review everything other people have found and say, okay, where is my space? And it may not be perfect, but this is sort of the logical sequence in which we go, right? So that's the second step, like I said, is establishing the niche, right? There are multiple ways of doing this, right? So here what we are showing is how previous research does not address specific issues. Okay, so you have to make that very clear. Now, within that context, our first step is counterclaiming, right? So you can look at recent phenomenon, what other people are doing, and say, hey, look at what they found, but that does not necessarily, matter here. I would like to find an explanation for this, right? So, for example, in today's doctor class, we were talking about institutional theory, right? So, the ideas behind institutional theory are that time period A, the new institutional theory are that time period A and time period B, factors that drive adoption of innovations in time period A are not related to time period B. There are other papers that come and say, hey, you know what? The classic paper told me that time period A and time period B are unrelated factors that are, driving adoption for new administrative innovations are unrelated. But I'm going to try and show you that it turns out that that's not necessarily the case. I'm going to find a common thread between these two that show me that there are some underlying assumptions we are making about why they said they were unrelated, but it turns out that they're related, right? So you're sort of trying to challenge some of the previous findings or indicate a gap, saying people have not explained this yet on how they are related, or raising a question. There is a question that still remains. So in my case, if I want to say that workers with disabilities are productive, workers with disabilities are not productive, there are lots of gray areas in between. Now, what really drives that productivity could be my source of investigation, right? So there are different ways you can frame it, like the results is challenging the recent data, considerable amount of research is focused on, yet this question remains, the question remains. So I'm just giving you some ballpark sentences, that one can use, and we'll talk more about semantics in a second. Now, the important part of occupying a niche is what is the contribution you're making, right? So because most of us, at least in any editorial role, we want to tell you, okay, tell me what is the contribution of your paper, right? That's sort of there are different buckets that we can put contributions into. Okay, so straight up replication. Actually, we have a SMJ forthcoming, which is a straight up replication piece. It's not easy to do. You really get lucky doing replications. I have to be honest about that. And I credit my colleague for thinking about that. So we basically look at one is straight up replication. The second part is what you're essentially going after is, hey, we said some result held in time period A. We are going to test if the result holds in time period B. So what is the most important thing about replication? What kind of problems you want to replicate? Really, important problems, like, theoretical concepts that have that hold over time, right? So that's what we can go and replicate. Some really important studies in the past, we can go replicate with new data, right? But that's sort of important. Then you can do replication and extension. So that's a contribution. The third part is extension of new theory, a new theory method in a new area. So for example, we had a paper last year where we were looking at, how long should software engineers be working on a task? And what are the resource implications for working for a longer time on the task? So we basically fit a survival model. We constructed a capacity planning framework on top of the survival model. And what we were essentially saying is that, hey, somebody else has done similar model in the context of healthcare, but when we port that into a traditional operations context, the implications can be fundamentally different. So it could be an integrative review, okay? Or there are reasons why you would do an integrative review. If people have completely different results that you find, and meta-analysis is all about discovery of moderators, right? Good moderators. Or develop a new theory to explain an old phenomenon, theory testing, compete one theory against another. Or identification of new phenomenon. And sometimes you just do a grand synthesis. These are very, very hard to do. I've never done one of those, but you can synthesize literature. A lot of AMR papers are neat synthesis of different concepts, and they present a framework, that sort of tries to explain a lot of different things, right? And then finally, you develop a new theory. That's probably the most challenging to do, right? So these are all on a continuum of contributions. Like the simplest one, none of them is really simple, but the most simplest one is straightforward replication, all the way down to developing a brand new theory. So we have to be clear about what we are doing as we are occupying the niche, right? That's the point. So just to give you a sense of how these different contributions are, this is from Nicholson. I think it's a JAMS paper. I thought they did a really neat job of putting together different papers and showing some numbers. And I still think it's very true of even operations as a domain. But you look at, they classify this into 4 types of contributions, right? Revelatory contributions, incremental contributions, replicatory contributions, and what they call as consolidatory contributions, where you're basically finding out what somebody has done, consolidating their work, and then building on them, right? It's like meta-analysis, traditional reviews, systematic reviews, or consolidatory contributions. Your goal is to sort of consolidate the literature, but you should be very precise about what you think you're going to summarize the literature is saying, right? You must have the top of the head points really clear. And then you go to replicatory contributions. You can see how few papers are actually consolidatory or replicatory. A vast majority are incremental or revelatory contributions, right? So, and this is what most editors typically look for. And there is also this entirely different question about what is scientifically interesting. I'm not going to go into that right now, but we could sort of debate what is scientifically interesting. And there are enough people who have written and talked about that, right? So, keeping these, there are, if you look at this particular set of contributions, the top half is basically, on revelatory is where you focus on counterclaiming and questions, right? Because you want to reveal something, you say claims, and then you say, hey, we can make counterclaims at this point. So that's sort of the revelatory part, right? And then in the incremental contributions is where you want to indicate a gap or tradition. So you can choose your pick, right? So, but it's really important to, as you're writing a paper, to build some cognitive rubrics around what is it that you're really going after. Once you get that clear, then I think things start falling into place, hopefully falling into place, right? It doesn't mean you won't have to go back or anything like that, but it's important to sort of pay some reasonable attention, right? So the four continuing parts are basically counterclaiming, indicating a gap, continuing a tradition, taking stock of what we have done, right? And then the last part is sort of continuing traditions for replicatory contribution. So that's sort of the core structure around how we can organize some of these research framework. And it doesn't matter whether it's analytical paper or an empirical paper. My thinking is that they all ought to be the same. Did we have questions here? Want to find out if various speakers could share their slides. Yes, I will be happy to share my slides at the end of it. No problem. So, so let's look at a couple of other aspects on contribution. So one is sort of theoretical and practical. So as you are thinking about occupying your niche, you also, at least in business operations type journals, we really care about rigor versus relevance. Sometimes your contribution could be higher rigor. Okay, and other times your contribution could be showing relevance of a problem. I'll tell you what, my more recent papers on disability stuff, I don't think I want to make it rigorous, but I still feel like I can go a very long way, really long way, right? It's very hard to make it rigorous for a lot of different reasons. Okay, but if I ask myself, is it relevant? I would say absolutely yes, because there is a clear societal challenge that we are facing, and how we can actually try to address some of those societal problems. So you can find varying degrees of problems, right? In other cases, you might be super rigorous, like let's say you want to do forecasting. I would rather be super rigorous and make sure that I'm sort of predicting something right? So so within the context of method, context, and theory, as three big contribution domains, we are trying to occupy a unique space. So when we think about niches, all I'm trying to get at is that there are several ways of thinking about your niche. First is contribution is one aspect of your niche. Second is how does method, context, and theory come together itself is a unique aspect of your occupying niche, right? So your introduction should be able to say something about these elements, okay? Any questions so far? Okay. So this Nicholson paper is really cool because what they did was they picked up all of these papers and they analyzed semantics, okay? And that's why I said I'll share the study with you, the slides with you guys. If you just want to take it and look at all the sources, that's perfectly fine, right? So, and if you find more, please send me emails saying, oh, I found this really cool thing. I'd be happy to integrate it into my slides. So here, what they are doing is things like, neglect spotting, right? So you look at the terms people have used: neglect, rare, poor reporting, not defined, scarce, lack of empirical insight, papers ignore or ignores, dearth of literature, something has been underutilized. So look at the semantics. They're all sort of all around neglect spotting. So here, these are papers that have actually spotted some aspect of an area that was neglected by other researchers, and they're using these kind of semantics, okay? And then confusion spotting is another one, right? Where we are making a contribution, where you say, okay, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to clarify the research or poor understanding. So for example, my SMJ paper was kind of in this realm. How we ended up positioning it, what we essentially said was, hey, let's take a simple idea that organizations tend to outsource, activities. So we ended up framing it as alliances in the end, but this was the essence of the idea, right? We say, if you want to outsource activities, on one hand, we will say that outsourcing activities should improve my financial performance, because that's what the literature used to say in that time, that, it's good for your bottom line. But then there is also this other issue that outsourcing activities should actually be bad for long run innovation. There are a lot of theories that sort of try to say that. But then those innovations are again important for financial performance. Now, what do you do, right? So, so there is this basic confusion when we look at literature on how they would set up these three components. So we said, okay, this is really our tension that we are trying to resolve, and our entire empirical structure was framed around these three activities, right? So, and we can what we said was the literature is kind of inconclusive about the overall implications of this, and we went about trying to estimate that from our empirical analysis, right? So, and there are different semantics. I'll probably spare the semantics for now. I'll be happy to share this with you, the slides with you, and the paper also, right? So then on context spotting, there are a number of different ideas. So for example, let's say that you are pulling ideas from healthcare into traditional service operations. Are there something that are fundamentally different from in traditional service operations compared to healthcare? That's a context spotting exercise. Excuse me. So you want to complement your understanding, you want to extend somebody's understanding, so these are typically terminologies that you use. Now, a general niche establishment within the CARS framework is very similar. So this is straight from the CARS framework, and I'm going to show you how papers that have looked at these semantic analysis are so similar, right? Contrast, quantity, verbs, and adjectives, right? So contrast are however, but yet, nevertheless, unfortunately, and although. So these are contrast adjectives. You got to, these are the ones that sort of, sorry, contrast words, right? But these are sort of gives us some sense of how you're going to develop ideas later, right? So quantity, how much of other research have done, the verb, what have these verbs done, what have these studies done, and then adjectives, some element of attributing traits to the quality of that work that has been done, right? So all four are equally important within the CARS framework. Now, this is as far as niche goes, right? So let's recap. What do we do to point to the niche? You first want to outline your contributions, okay? And then you want to show, you want to know what continuum your contribution is in. You want to then try to stake your ground on what are these elements. And then your contribution could be on the intersection of method, context, and theory as well. And then you use the right words and semantics to be able to show a reader, what that gap is, okay? Now, how do you occupy the niche? Now, in occupying the niche, you ultimately say, hey, I have shown you the gap. Now I'm going to tell you what exactly I'm going to do, right? You outline the purpose. My purpose is to exactly fill this gap, show how A affects B within the context of the gap. Going back to the outsourcing paper, all I'm saying is that, look, all these differing predictions should ultimately lead us to think that whether a firm gains from outsourcing or does not gain from outsourcing is not very clear to me. So maybe I need to go to the empirical data now that I've developed this theoretical idea to be able to see what I'm going to see. Now, it's exciting enough that I need to actually run the data. If the idea is not exciting that I need to run the data, I don't even want to go to the data. So there is that element of a little bit of suspense that's built in, right? Then you want to announce your present research, right? There you have to think about what, who, how, where, and when, right? And then you basically start out certain sentences in terms of, in the study we propose, da, da, da. Of course, I'm not saying these are the only ways. There are lots of different ways of thinking about it. And then you clearly say, this paper, this is what I focus on. Usually I find it easy to read papers that directly tell you what they are focusing on. Then what I'm doing is I'm then starting to look for, okay, did they really do this? Okay, so if you're claiming I did this, then your job is easier for a reader, that you just have to show them you did it, right? And you did it well. Then you're basically getting into this intellectual debate of how well did I do it? That's easier to actually convince or not otherwise, right? And then you announce your main finding and then indicate the structure of your paper, and then finally evaluate the findings. For example, let's say you are trying to look at scope 3 reduction in supply chain, emissions reduction in supply chains. What you're saying is, hey, I think that if your network is of a certain type, you're likely to have a lot more difficult time in reducing scope 3 by so much percent. You're likely to have a lot more difficulty in reducing scope 3 perhaps the more the complexity of the network, the more difficult it is to reduce scope 3. Some amount of economic benefit if you can show, right? Now, I'll probably just go through these quickly enough. So these are coming from this Ragan's editorial in AMR. What I tried to do is emphasize the importance of each of these steps and what reviewers would say. And I think it's reasonable to say that every journal has faced this. So that's why I felt free to use material from that editorial, right? So this is sort of what reviewers say. In my experience, announcing the purpose of the paper, right? Many authors fail to effectively problematize the literature and articulate a compelling theoretical contribution. I believe this happens because authors are too close to their own ideas, anticipate what about them will be original and important to others, right? So what can you do to fix this? After finishing a draft, either put your paper away for several weeks, come back. Most of the time, we don't have time. We just want to finish writing a paper, submit it for review. It's not a good idea. So you want to basically write it, either give it to your buddy and say, the easiest person is your spouse. If you have a really critical spouse, it's a good thing, right? So you can give them your paper, okay? And say, tell me, does this read well? And I'll tell you what, I've been beaten up many times. Oh, this doesn't make any sense. I don't know what you guys are doing. You're just wasting your time on a trivial problem. You should do more important problems, right? I mean, that would be an easy comment to get, but it's a good thing. I don't want to spend my time on trivial problems either. So never underestimate the value of focusing on a topic that's relevant to management practice. Relevance is extremely important nowadays, at least nowadays, okay? When you present the research, announce the present research, you want to set the hook properly. Many times, I personally do not appreciate papers that overclaim. You are really setting yourself up for failure. The easiest thing for a reviewer to do is to basically come back and tell you, hey, you said you do these things. You said you'll solve the world's problems, but you're not solving the world's problems. It's very easy rejection. We should force people to actually think about your paper. The easiest way to force people to think about your paper is to not claim a whole lot, but just state the facts and let people make up their minds. At least I tend to try to do that, right? And the other thing to be able to do this is like the first question I asked, how many times do you iterate, right? So iterate 100 times if this is what it takes to hook the reader. The bigger question is, are you hooked? That's the key. And what's a good merit of, am I hooked to the paper? Do I, at the end of thinking about the question or at the end of thinking about my framing, am I thinking about the problem for an hour? It's like falling in love with somebody, right? So if you fall in love with somebody, you can't stop thinking about them. So it's like that, you just fall in love with your problem, right? And you can't stop thinking about it. Then suddenly lots of cool solutions will come, lots of framing will come. And our SMJ paper was like that, so we spent so much time thinking about what is the framing. We just didn't like our framing. Why should I work on this problem? Finally, when we figured out what the hook was, then we went to the data. I think we actually had some joy in estimating the model too. But it's sort of interesting to think about it that way, right? So so here is another one, right? Here, I made comments on the paper you wrote. This is an advisor to a student, right? So I say, I got a little carried away with the red ink. So I summarized my comments in back page. Is there anything else, anything you liked about it, right? But it's sort of an extreme version of this. But the point is that I feel about my own paper like that the first time I write it, right? So if you leave it for some time, you come back, I'm sure you've had this experience. I don't like what I did, right? So you don't, that sort of, if you feel that, it's normal. So do not feel bad, right? So announcing the finding, right? So each manuscript contains one key point. You should be able to state it in one sentence. So if you have to, the easiest way to do this is to sit down with your spouse or with your mother. I think there's a mom test here later on, or your dad, and just say, this is what I found. What do you think about this? And see whether you can hook them on a normal conversation. It's very challenging. Of course, if you're working in pure sciences, you can't do that. You can't explain Kalman filter to your mom, but you can certainly explain a sociological phenomenon to your mom, right? I mean, there's certainly there is reason there, right? So I'm going to skip the rest. You can read the text, right? And I'll anyway send it to you. And writing by hand is always a nice thing. So what I tend to do is I do not write by hand. I am probably a little lazy for that, but I do think a lot about my problems. You know, if I'm working on a paper, most of the time, still I frame the whole thing. I'm constantly thinking about it just because I enjoy it. This is sort of the mom test, right? I'm simply tired of reading passage of manuscript 2 or 3 times just to figure out what authors might be trying to say. Counsel young writers to first explain their ideas to their mothers with a recorder running. Then pretty close to how they explained it orally. Yeah, so it's a pretty neat way of saying it. Particularly for doctoral students, what I tend to tell them is that I was taught this, that you should have a 2-minute elevator speech. Right? I mean, if you're going to the job market, you should have a 2-minute elevator speech. If you can walk up with somebody on an elevator, by the time you're done, get to your floor in the hotel room, you can explain to them what your dissertation is doing, then you have something really interesting and important. If you cannot, then we are in trouble, right? So that's to me, a good test of thinking about this. And then, of course, announcing and differentiating the research, right? So the comprehensiveness of literature review, just cut to the chase, keep it short, and address all the dimensions. Try visualizing. I've in many papers, I sort of, particularly if it's a busy area, and I will tell you what, in supply chain, there are a ton of busy areas. Supply chain innovation is one of those, which is actually a very busy area. Trust, collaboration, very busy areas, right? So you just don't want another paper on innovation, trust, and collaboration. So you just want to be able to detail out exactly what's going on. So in those settings, a reader is helped if you're able to even put tables together, right? And piece together a literature review. You're not writing a literature review paper, but you're sort of showing some very clear gaps, right? Cutting to the chase. This is really, I have committed this sin many times. I get reviews back which say, I went up to page 6 and you have still not told me what problem you're working on, right? And it's always challenging to get there. Try to get to the problem in the first 3 or 4 pages. So I'll show you some typical format that I try to follow, but it does not work all the time, but it's certainly, reasonable to follow, I guess. So it's important not to overpromise. You want to ensure that, to deliver what you promised. I already mentioned this. Explicitly structure your message, your subheadings. Sometimes, I find that readers are a quick reader. What they tend to do is they tend to look at all of your subheadings, all of your hypotheses and propositions. That's like a 10-minute read. I just want to know what they're doing. I'm going to read their abstract and skim through exactly what they're doing. So you should also be prepared for that kind of a reader. So you have to be able to structure your message, outline the bullets, and build an outline of the argument. So what I tend to recommend to at least my people who have worked with me, or I do this, is I usually write out a bulleted outline of a full paper. I do not write out the paper. Then keeping it, framing. Most authors don't do a very good job of compelling a front end. Again, you can see how important that is. I always tell my junior colleagues that the right answer to any numerical question is 5 plus or minus 2. That's the number of unique items somebody can hold on your memory. This goes down to how many paragraphs you should have in the introduction, right? Maybe not more than 7 or 8, right? And I'll show you a format that I tend to generally recommend. And of course, setting up the hook. So you address these different dimensions, including practice here by picking up the one major contribution that you're making, and then all the other secondary contributions. Try to give examples as much as possible. At least in journals like JOM, IJOPM, or JSCM, all of these journals, when you sort of go, my experience is reviewers do come back and ask you for what is the example? Show me real world examples. So I can anchor myself on the head how this is going. Thank you, Wendy. I think I should be done in another 5 minutes. This is sort of one of the simple ideas. I always like papers that visualize, a model, an empirical model. If you're working on empirical papers, I think it's always nice to even visualize analytical papers. Like, for example, what are the threads? You have a core model and all the special cases to a model, and then assumptions behind those special cases, relaxations of those assumptions. You can construct those threads in your head, how you're going. And then what this allows us to do is that, okay, I know there is one central contribution, but I can identify the threads that stem from that one central contribution. Because a really good paper does not, of course, has one solid central contribution, but can have elements that stem from that central contribution, okay? So that's where I think of future connections. Once you have specified the stream of literature, right, that you're contributing in the first paragraph, what you're trying to solve that literature in your second paragraph, you should use your third paragraph to answer the question on how will you solve the problem that you've identified. You can give an overview of an approach, the methods that we talked about before, right? And then just give bare essentials of answers early on, but then you can dig deeper later on in the paper, because now you got them hooked. It's like the carrot image that I was showing you in the beginning, that the reader basically goes one step, second step, third step, but now I'm like, I want to learn what is happening. How did they do this? Did they really do this right? And that's the core idea, right? And you want to visualize the paper, right? Justify the need for every paragraph you write. This took me a very long time, actually, to be frank with you. I still sometimes write superfluous things, but every paragraph that you write ought to be special. It should deserve the real estate on the paper, right? And of course, from a reader's perspective, you should have a roadmap. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the reader. I think if I were to take one big tip, this is what even my advisor always used to tell me, that put your paper away for a while, divorce yourself from it after you write it, and then come back and look at it. You are going to find a lot of problems and rewrite it. So it takes a long time to get it to some reasonable structure, right? And there are questions that you think through. Okay, is it intended? Is the meaning clear? Is the manuscript logically structured? Is there a good balance between my own direct argumentation and embedding of work in existing literature streams? And this is where sometimes it's really important to read the papers you're citing. Many times I personally find that people just cite the paper for the sake of citing it and do not necessarily read it. And you know what, sometimes it can lead us into embarrassment, because the reviewers are the people who you have cited, and then they're saying, oh, I didn't necessarily say this thing. What are they talking about? Did they even read my paper? Right, so you don't want to do that. Those are sort of not necessarily how to write an introduction, but it happens. So authors are often so involved in their work that they sort of fail to leave out. It's like, you love yourself so much you don't see your own flaws, right? So and that's why we get upset when we get a rejection, I guess. So my logic is reviewers are always right, okay? Unless you can prove them wrong, right? Because they've seen your paper not being you. I know that we have a biased eye, but certainly something to remember, right? And just a checklist, okay? What am I focusing on? Why is this problem relevant? What is known? What is not known? If you can write a simple bullet point list for yourself, right? What is my burning question? Does this really need me to run data? That's what I was trying to tell you before. If you can answer your burning question without running data, please don't bother working on the problem. Let's just put it away and do something else, right? Because it's every time you touch a paper, you are not touching it for 2 months. You are touching it for 5 years. Remember, I was telling somebody this, that you get a revision, you're writing 2 papers. Right? If you get a revision, you're writing 2 papers. You're not writing 1 paper. Even if you get a rejection, you're writing 1 paper because you're not writing a response note, right? So, but if you get a revision, you're writing 2 papers. You should be ready for it. And is this approach credible? appropriately developed? Have findings been described appropriately? Are they powerful enough? And you know, have the importance of the findings been communicated in the backdrop? All this should be in the introduction. So if you're able to answer all of these basic questions in the introduction for yourself, then you have something that you're going to write about, right? So I'm going to skip the exercise because what, if it is longer, you can go through a paper and work on it for 2-3 hours and then write out your bullet points, pick up a project and do that. But perhaps this is not going to be the best time. I'm going to leave about 10 minutes for questions. This is just a duplicated slide where, I'm just recapping, claiming centrality, topic generalizations, reviewing items of previous research, show how previous research has not addressed the issue. So what are some takeaways? Just be clear of the topic and the phenomenon. Usually know what is the final goal. And that only comes if you have thought hard enough. I would say think about the topic for several days. I start writing introduction first. I know some of my colleagues don't, my own collaborators. We have discussed what is right, what is not right. There are no right answers, I think, on this. But before I write the introduction, I think about the paper like for days on end, right? And then have you articulated all positions? If needed, draw a mind map. Sometimes mind maps are very cool tools to actually try to use. I think I'm going to stop here. Yeah, don't seek perfection. It's an iterative process. Don't compress it in the first attempt. It does not happen, at least for me. I mean, these have worked for me. Some people like to expand. I like to write a lot and keep cutting it because I know what everybody's saying, right? And you can choose your take. So the thing I want to is this, right? So how do I love you paper, right? Let me count the different ways. Actually, it's a thesis. I converted that into a paper. It doesn't matter if it's a thesis or a paper, but you think about it night and day. You see it in the dreams. You sing praises far and wide, right? You write odes to that no one will ever read. You know that sometimes your paper, not everybody's going to read it, but that's okay, right? I mean, you still have to do a good job with it, right? And you weep in the absence, right? Because you're anxious, waiting for the review to come in, and you count days before you get it accepted, right? So that's all I'm going to say. And if you have any questions, we have about 8 minutes more. Wendy, did I do okay on time?
That is fantastic, Sriram. As always, it was perfection. So thank you so much for your delivery and for all those comments. And as I mentioned, this is one of the hot topics, like how do we get our manuscripts past that desk reject stage? And so we've got to make it so that it's interesting.